We are Life Church Livonia.
All right, good morning, Life Church. We did a great job of introducing Jeremy to you and talking about our plans for middle school ministries, but we forgot to tell you that it's happening today. And so Jeremy's in the back. If you're part of that ministry, head on to the back. Jeremy can wave his hand. He's back there somewhere. There he is. Head on back and you join him, and I'm really excited about what God's doing there. So my name is Brian. I am the pastor here. If we've not had a chance to meet, I would love to meet you. And that question that we set you up with a little earlier about, have you ever ridden in a small engine aircraft, came straight from me. Because I love riding in airplanes. Not the kind of airplanes where they cram you into a tiny seat and that you feel like you have no space and make you pay for a glass of water. Not that kind of airplane. I don't like that kind of airplane at all. In fact, one of the airlines I refer to as Break Your Spirit Airlines. I don't know if you've ever experienced this before, but I'm not a fan of that, right? The kind of airplane that I'm talking about are the really small ones. And the very first time I ever had a chance to ride in one was when I lived in Alaska. And a friend, there's actually in Alaska more people that have their pilot's license per capita than anywhere else in the world. Anywhere in the world. If you are interested in aviation, move to Alaska. It's filled with people because most of the places that you would want to go to they aren't accessible by car. You can't just drive there. You need to fly there or take a boat there. And so there's a lot of people that own planes, a lot of people that have their pilot's license out of necessity. And a friend of mine took me up when I was a pastor there in his airplane. It was a little 4-seater airplane and flew me over our town. And so I want you to picture what this was like as we lived in a place called Eagle River. It was within just a few miles of the ocean. It was nestled in this mountainous valley with a river that came down through. It originated in a glacier at the end of the valley. It was just a few miles away. And so he flew me over this valley and up to the end and over the mountains, and it was incredible. It was also terrifying, but it was incredible. And so it's really interesting because what struck me in that experience, beyond the beauty was just there, right? The overwhelming feeling of being there was that there's a huge difference between being 30,000 feet up in a commercial airliner where the ground looks like a patchwork quilt, right? The massive fields of crops looks like a quilt. Where you couldn't see an individual car or an individual person if you had to, unless you have binoculars. And there's a huge difference between that and being in a smaller aircraft where you're maybe just 1,000 feet off the ground, where you're flying over your own home and you could tell whether or not your children are playing in the front yard or whether your wife went to Walmart, right? That's a totally different experience. And so in that moment, we were high enough to get a new perspective, but not so far away to prevent us from seeing the details. So we were high enough to get a new perspective, but not so far away that we couldn't make out the individual details. And there were things about my own town that I lived in that I had never noticed before until I was above it. Until I was in a space where I could see the whole thing spread out before me, to see the way it was situated on the earth, the way that it was tilted a little bit and wasn't true north-south, the way that the roads connected, the way that there was a closer distance between my friend's house and mine than I actually thought, because when I drove there, I had to go all the way around the river. I saw things from the air, from that new perspective that I'd never seen before. And what I want you to know is that for me, for all of us, for you, that is what it could be like for you as you begin to engage God's word in a different way. To begin to engage God's word in a manner that doesn't just look at a specific verse and read that verse and then pull back and then jump into another verse, a month later in a different section of the Bible to read one little section from the book of John and then next week jump into the book of Revelation, and the week after that jump into one of the Psalms. That is beautiful, and there's things you can gain from that that's valuable in that. But as you begin to read larger sections of Scripture, As you begin to dive into the cultures that existed there, not just the single life of a single person, but their family and the way that their family plays out through multiple generations. As you begin to do that, as you begin to move beyond just Googling a verse that matches your day, you begin to see things that you wouldn't have seen before. You begin to gain a new perspective that you wouldn't have had without this opportunity to see the greater story. Googling verses that match your situation for today can be helpful. You can go into online, you can say, verse that helps when I'm feeling anxious. Boom, it pops up like a dozen verses. You read those verses and it's helpful. It speaks to your life. You can, you Google verses to help me when my children are driving me crazy, right? Those actually exist, right? You can Google all these different things, and we need those verses, but we need the verses that speak to us today, but we also need the stories that give us perspective on our whole life. We need the verses that speak to our current situation right now, but we also need the stories, the meta-narrative, the big picture, 1,000, 2,000, 5,000, 10,000 foot view kind of stories that help us to gain perspective on the entirety of our life. And if all we ever do is pick out verses that match our current experiences, we'll miss out on aspects, amazing aspects of God's story that we need. That you need, that I need, that our whole culture needs, and we'll also miss out on aspects of our own personal development. And what will end up happening is there will be unexamined aspects of our own story that have never been compared to the stories that are found in God's word. And my hope is that we could do that a little bit together today. My hope is that as we engage in this group experience that we're calling Immerse, as we read the whole section of the Old Testament together, my hope is that would happen to you. And the very first time I went up in that airplane, it was overwhelming, right? There were so many experiences and so many sensations that I'd never experienced before, so many things that were confusing to me that I didn't understand how it worked. And the same thing can be true of God's word, but the more you do it, the more often you do it, the more natural it begins to be, and the more things begin to appear to you in the stories. My hope is that today that we'd be able to unravel parts of two books of the Bible, 1st and 2nd Samuel. Two huge chunks of scripture that tell some of the most famous stories that we have in the Old Testament. My hope is that today that we could fly over them at about 1,000 feet, maybe 2,000 feet. And my hope is that as we do that, that you would see things in there that you haven't seen before. And that the stories and the story arc would inform your life and would inform mine. 1 Samuel picks up the story of God's people, the Israelites, as they transition into really their first monarchies. They're transitioning from being ruled primarily by God to now being ruled by kings, and it's not a really smooth transition for them. Many issues are happening. But one of the things that we see as we read all of 1st and 2nd Samuel, as we read that entire section of scripture, one of the things that I see over and over again are poorly managed relationships. Poorly managed relationships that lead to dysfunction, that lead to pain, that lead to struggle at an interpersonal level, as well as a struggle in their whole nation, honestly. There's times when those interpersonal, poorly managed relationships interpersonally actually spills over into the national arena. There's times when people's private issues became very public issues because they didn't deal with them appropriately. Over and over again, we see this. We see this in the beginning of 1 Samuel when Eli, who is the priest at the time, he's ignoring the conflicts and the issues that he has with his own sons. They were supposed to be living into this priestly role, and yet they were scoundrels. We don't see him engaging their activity, their behavior, and managing those broken relationships in a way that's helpful, and it ends up really causing issues for many people in the temple. It causes issue for people that are coming and trying to offer their own sacrifices, their own worship experiences. It's disruptive to everything that was happening in that space, and yet Eli never engages it. And because he never engages it, it gets worse and worse and worse until the time when God has to remove them, not only from their current situation, but permanently remove them from the priestly line. poorly managed issues within their relationships. You jump in from there to the story of Samuel and Saul, and Saul is anointed as the very first king, and this guy had interpersonal issues on top of interpersonal issues. And one of the most obvious ones that we read about in the story is the issues that Saul had with this young shepherd boy named David. This young shepherd boy that comes out from his father's kind of sheep, herding business to suddenly slaying one of the rival enemy's captains. And now he's thrust onto the national scene. And from the very beginning, they have issues in their relationship. People are talking really well about David and beginning to talk poorly about Saul, and it created this funky bitterness and jealousy between Saul and David that never gets dealt with in a godly manner. It never gets addressed in a way that helps. Saul begins to question David's motives, and he begins to hear whispers in the people, and the people are saying, David has killed his 10,000s, but Saul only his thousands. And Saul lays in bed at night and ruminates on that, and it begins to spoil in his heart. So he begins to go after David, and it gets so bad that he began to have murderous intentions toward this young man who had really saved their whole society, their whole nation. Begin to triangulate relationships. We often look at the relationship between Jonathan and David, and we celebrate that in the church. And there were some beautiful things in their relationship and their friendship. But we also, if we really take the 1,000-foot view and we look at it, we realize that there was some crazy triangulation going on there. You had Jonathan, who was Saul's son. You had David, who was this up-and-coming leader. You had Saul, who was supposed to be the wise leader and the king. And they're one's talking to the other, and the other is talking to the next one. And they're playing a game of telephone and tag about their problems and about their issues. And Jonathan's like, tell you what, you go hide in the field, and I'll go talk to my dad. And I'm going to send you a message by shooting an arrow. And if I shoot it to the right, it means this. And if I shoot it to the left, it means this. And it says, what kind of games are you playing? What kind of modeling are you doing for the people around you about how to deal with conflict? About how to engage your interpersonal issues, the things that cause you to struggle. Eventually, David becomes king. He becomes king. He replaces Saul because Saul just got more and more unhealthy. And even though David was a man that longed to honor God, the New Testament talks about him as a man after God's own heart. And so even though we know that about David, that this is a guy that really wanted to live out his faith and did his very best to honor his commitments to God. And honestly, there were a lot of spaces where he did a great job. David would have been the guy in a lot of ways that comes to church and everyone's like, man, that guy knows Jesus. That was him. He was an incredible military commander, and yet David had interpersonal issues. Deep interpersonal issues, struggles that never were fully addressed, things that affected not only him, but affected all the people around him. He especially had issues with women. At one point, he's king, and he notices a woman bathing on a rooftop, and this woman named Bathsheba, she was married to another man. He lusts after her, and he's like, I want her. And he takes her for his own, impregnates her. And then plays these relational games where he tries to pass off the baby as her own husband's, and that doesn't work. And so he plots this scheme and ends up trying to get the husband killed and eventually succeeds. Takes Bathsheba as his wife. Broken relationships. Poorly managed conflict. We see it throughout his entire life. Their kids and all the other children that David had, most of them were a hot mess relationally. We see relational dysfunction heaped on top of relational dysfunction. And I think if 1 and 2 Samuel were to be made into a TV show, it would be a reality TV show. I don't even know, like Beverly Hills Housewives kind of a TV show, right? Or maybe if David and his family were alive today, they may have ended up on Dr. Phil, right? Complete with the DNA tests, the paternity tests, like we're going to reveal the day whether Bathsheba's baby is Uriah's or David's, right? Maybe not Dr. Phil. If you're old enough, who remembers Jerry Springer? Right? They may have ended up on Jerry Springer where the siblings are all there and they're fighting. There's a fist fight that breaks out in the middle of the show. People ate that up in the late 90s here, right? In the early 2000s. Their life was messy because their relationships were messy and they didn't manage them well. What happens if we fly over their story at 1,000 feet? What happens if we begin to get a broader perspective? One of the key takeaways from that story begins to emerge is this. We have to learn how to navigate relational conflict if we don't want to pass it on. We have to learn to navigate the brokenness in us and the brokenness between us if we don't want to pass it on to the people around us. We worry across the nation. We have this fear, this worry about different issues that we could pass on with our health. We worry about COVID-19, the coronavirus. And we have people rushing to the store to buy masks because they don't want to catch what other people are giving. And yet, so often in our life, we live in this space where we are passing on relational diseases and not even looking at it. Not even worrying about it. I would tell you today that the way that we pass on the brokenness that and the ways that we manage our relationships and the way we do or don't engage in conflict is a far greater epidemic or pandemic than any virus that's come out of any country. And yet it remains unaddressed. We have to learn how to navigate relational conflict if we don't want to pass it on. And too often what ends up happening is we handle conflict the way that our family handled conflict. We see the way that our parents or our extended family, our aunts and uncles and grandparents, we see the way they did conflict and we just model our life after them. And sometimes that works out really well. But all too often, we miss out on learning how to handle conflict God's way. And even David, who was a man after God's own heart, had areas of his life that were clearly not in alignment with God's design for his life. There were areas of his life that he never fully surrendered over to God. He was a master at military conflict, but he was a novice when it came to interpersonal conflict. So the question is, how do we look at his story, learn from his mistakes, and learn how to surrender all the parts of our life, including those interpersonal struggles? I want to jump in today to a very specific part of his story and help you to see the way that played out. And my hope is that you would be able to see aspects of your own story and theirs and learn from their mistakes. As I mentioned earlier, David had an issue with women. He had many wives and many children from many different women. And today we're going to look at 3 of those children: Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom. 2 brothers and a sister, all of them half siblings. And we're going to pick up their story in 2 Samuel chapter 13. In the course of time, Amnon, son of David, fell in love with Tamar, the beautiful sister of Absalom, son of David. Amnon became so obsessed with his sister Tamar that he made himself ill. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. We could read this 100 times and see 100 different things that were broken about this. It's unbelievable. You have this young man, Amnon, who claims to be in love with his half-sister Tamar, but it's actually not love, it's lust. And he's so obsessed with her, it actually says that in the scripture, he's obsessed with her, that he makes himself sick thinking about it. He makes himself sick lusting over this woman. She was a virgin, and it seemed impossible for him to do anything to her. That's gross. Right? There's some real brokenness here. And we also see some generational sin here, okay? Like father, like son. David had unaddressed issues with women, and now he passed those unaddressed issues on to his children. That's a sermon for another day. And as the story goes on, Amnon's struggle gets worse and worse and worse. So people begin to notice, they're like, what's wrong, Amnon? What's wrong? What's going on? And finally, this sleazy advisor to Amnon named Jonadab, we know he's sleazy because later in the story, we see him playing both sides of the game. Triangulation is happening again. Jonadab comes to him and says, sir, I see you're really struggling. How can I help you? And so Amnon says, well, here's the deal. I'm really into Tamar, and I don't know what to do about it. And Jonadab is like, I know what to do about it. I'm going to set it up so you can lure her into your bedroom, and then you can do whatever you want. So broken. And it leads to its natural conclusion where Tamar is lured into Amnon's room, and he takes advantage of her and rapes her. So much brokenness. And after that incident occurs, it says this in 2 Samuel 13:19. Tamar put ashes on her head, which is a sign of grieving, and tore the ornate robe she was wearing. She put her hands on her head and went away weeping loud as she went. Her brother Absalom said to her, has that Amnon, your brother, been with you? Be quiet for now, my sister. He's your brother. Don't take this thing to heart. And Tamar lived in her brother Absalom's house, a desolate woman. When King David heard all this, he was furious, and Absalom never said a word to Amnon, either good or bad. He hated Amnon because he had disgraced his sister Tamar. There are so many parts of the story that we could engage in. But I want to talk about the way they managed conflict, the way they managed the brokenness interpersonally between them. And this is one of the main points I want you to walk away with today. Ignoring problems doesn't make them go away. Ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. Ignoring the issues between you and your spouse, or you and your best friend, or you and your boss, it won't make it go away. Look at the ways they tried to make it go away in the story. Amnon is struggling with these feelings of lust towards his sister. He never talked to his dad about it. He could have gone to his dad and talked about his issues, talked about what was happening. Tamar then gets violated in this awful way. And the first thing she does is go back to her brother Absalom and says, this is what happened. And then what does Absalom say to her? Don't tell anyone. Sweep it under the rug. He's your brother. You shouldn't tell. Well, someone told, because then David finds out about it. David's furious, but what happens there? He doesn't say anything. He doesn't go and talk to Tamar. He doesn't go and address the issue with Amnon. He doesn't even go and talk about it with Absalom. Absalom is furious as well, and he's super mad at Amnon, as he should have been. What Amnon did was wrong, but he never said a word to him. The text actually says that exact phrase. It says, he hated Amnon, but he never said a word to him, either good or bad. Not a single word. Every single one of them were upset at this unbelievably awful situation that had occurred, but none of them chose to talk about it. What do we learn? What if instead of ignoring conflict in your own life, you chose to talk about it? What if instead of trying to sweep it under the rug and hope that it goes away, that we actually chose to engage in it? How would that change your relationships? How would that change your marriage? How would that change your friendships? How would that change your situation at work? And for some of you, even thinking about this starts to make you sweat, right? You're like, conflict is, as in my home, in my life, is a dirty word. But not all conflict is bad. What makes conflict bad is the way we respond to it, the way that we engage it. And I know that for many people, this can be incredibly overwhelming because you've never done this. You've never seen it done well. You've never engaged it in your life. Your family never did it. And you're sitting even today on a lifetime of unresolved issues that you never talked about with anyone. And all of those unresolved issues, all those unresolved conflicts are sitting right here. They're swirling right here. And they're poisoning your ability to have healthy relationships right here or out there. Unresolved conflict does that to us. And if that's you, I want to encourage you today to start somewhere. Start small if you need to, because ignoring problems doesn't make them go away. And so as I said, a good place to start is to start small. And I want to say this: start the conversation when the problem is small. Way too often, we wait until the problem is massive. It's huge. It's so big that it is completely overwhelming, and we don't know how we could ever dig ourselves out from underneath it. And so what I want to tell you today is start the conversation when the problem is small. Don't wait until it's massive. I want you to imagine how this scenario that we just read about in 2 Samuel would have changed had Amnon decided to go to his dad when he first started struggling with lustful thoughts towards his sister. What if he had started the conversation when the problem was small and gone to his dad, and maybe you're like, well, that's not really a small problem that he was into his sister, but it was small in the grand scheme of things, right? What if you gone to David and said, Dad, I know that this hasn't always been an area that you've really found a lot of success in, but what have you learned? I know that you've struggled with having feelings and longings for women that you shouldn't have. How did you manage that? And when you failed, what did you do? And what have you learned? He didn't ever talk to his dad about it. Maybe the reason he didn't talk to his dad about it is because he didn't believe his dad had anything to offer him. Maybe the reason he didn't talk to his dad about it is because he didn't feel like his dad had ever conquered it. I don't know. But what if they'd had a conversation? Going way back into the beginning of David's story, what if David had started small? What if in that moment when he saw Bathsheba on the roof, instead of just living into that, what if he had actually talked to someone? What if he'd started the conversation when the problem was small instead of waiting until it was so big that Uriah ends up dead and Tamar ends up raped and brokenness begins to escalate in their family? So often, friends, we choose to ignore problems in our relationships because we just hope they'll go away. We sweep them under the rug. We convince ourselves that they're no big deal. We say, oh, I'm just going to let that go. But we don't let it go. We hold on to it. And it festers. And it grows. And eventually they explode into something bigger. You'll know this is happening in your life if there are relationships that you have right now that have been derailed by a series of unaddressed issues. If you have a relationship in your life or a situation in your life that is kind of exploding right now and you can trace it back to a series of unaddressed issues, then you'll know that this is your story as well. You'll know this is your story if you've ever gone to a friend or a coworker or your spouse and dumped your frustrations on them and they're like, I had no idea. Like, whoa. Why didn't you talk to me about this last year? They get defensive and it creates new conflict. Maybe your family of origin never addressed conflicts in this way, but here's the good news. I want you to hear this because this is heavy, right? Even if your family of origin never addressed conflict, even if your family of origin never did this well, here's the great news that you have an opportunity to join a new family. It's called the family of God. It's this family. It's a family that's connected to you by what God has done in us and through us. And our family does conflict really well. God's family has a new way of doing this where we address it and we get healing from it and we grow through it. It's not too late. It's not too late to jump into a new way of doing life and a new way of doing conflict. And the best place to start is to start small. I want to jump back into their story because, believe it or not, it gets worse. You're like, how could it possibly get worse? Well, I'll tell you. Absalom, his anger never went away. He tried to sweep it under the rug. It didn't go away. And so it festers into this murderous intent. And instead of making an attempt to talk about it, he just gets more and more angry about it. It's interesting, he never even made an attempt to find out whether Tamar's story was true. I believe it was true, but he never made an attempt to verify it. Instead, he waits a few years and then he plans a dinner party. He invites all of his brothers, including Amnon, to the dinner party, and this is what happens at that dinner party. 2 Samuel says this. Absalom ordered his men, listen, when Amnon is in high spirits from drinking wine, and I say to you, strike Amnon down, then kill him. By the way, that's not a very subtle password. He's not like, when I make the sound of a bird, strike him down. He's like, when I tell you, strike him down, I want you to kill him. And so he needs to work on his subtlety. Don't be afraid, he says. Haven't I given you this order? Be strong and brave. So Absalom's men did to Amnon what Absalom had ordered. Then all the king's sons got up, mounted their mules, and fled. While they were on their way, the report came to David, Absalom has struck down all the king's sons. Not one of them is left. The king stood up, tore his clothes, and lay down on the ground. And all of his attendants stood by with their clothes torn. Really, really quick point here. The very first word that David gets about the situation is that all of his sons are dead. Was it true? No. Often the very first word you get about a conflict is going to be false. We're going to get to that in a minute. Super important. Even after the conflict has led to murder, I want you to see this. David never went and talked to Absalom. He never addressed it. He simply grieved for a few years, and then the text tells us that he began to long to have closer relationship with Absalom again. It's like he thought, if I just wait a few years and sweep it under the rug and never deal with it, never address it, everything is going to be okay and everything can go back to normal. But nothing had gone back to normal, because when conflict remains unaddressed, it almost always escalates. When conflict in your life remains unaddressed, it almost always escalates to become something that it didn't need to be. And my hope is that your conflict doesn't escalate the way theirs escalated. If so, there's a number you can call. I'll put it on the screen. No, I'm not going to. It's 911. Call that number, okay? Unaddressed conflict almost always escalates. And maybe it doesn't lead to murder, but it often leads to death. Death of a marriage, death of your dream job, death of a close friendship. And because David never went to talk to Absalom, a new conflict began to emerge that David was completely oblivious to. Listen to what happens. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate. And whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" He would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." And then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there's no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only there were an appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or case would come to me, and I would see that they receive justice." In this moment, Absalom is blatantly undermining the rule of his father by convincing everyone who was coming to David with their conflicts, with their problems, with their issues, with their grievances, everyone that was coming to David's place of rule to have their conflicts managed by the king was being met at the gate by Absalom. And Absalom is saying, if only there was someone here who cared. If only there was someone around that could help you manage your conflict. Why would he have done that? Why would Absalom have done that? And I believe it's this, is that Absalom had come to believe that David didn't care about him because he chose to ignore the problem rather than to deal with it. Absalom had begun to internalize this narrative that he believed, that he would tell himself, my dad must not care about me, because my dad never addressed Amnon's sin. My dad never went and talked to Tamar. My dad never came and talked to me. My dad didn't even show up when I killed my brother. So if my dad doesn't care about me, there's no way my dad cares about anyone else. There's no way my dad cares about their problems. I honestly believe that Absalom believed what he was telling the people. Sure, he was handling it in this really undermining way, in this really broken way, in this super passive-aggressive manner. But he learned that kind of relational engagement naturally from his family of origin. He had a narrative in his brain that he was telling himself over and over again because he was trying to make sense of a scenario that made no sense. And so he laid in bed at night and he invented all these things about his dad, and now he's sharing them with the people. And here's the interesting thing about that is that none of it was true. David cared deeply about Absalom. We see that in the text. Even after he had failed him in deep ways, he cared about Absalom. David cared deeply about his people. We see it over and over again. So the narrative was untrue, but none of that mattered to Absalom. How has that type of scenario played out in your life? Where have you had moments or seasons where you're laying in bed at night and you're creating narratives in your brain about your really difficult situations? And sometimes those narratives are really far from the truth, but the only way you can make sense of what's happening is to invent some type of story. And any story is better than no story at all. How often have you laid there rehearsing those narratives in your head about your relationships for so long that they become true to you? That even if you were confronted with an alternative truth, that you would struggle to receive it. When you're stuck in that space, do you check to make sure those narratives are true before you ruminate on them? Or do you just assume that they're true and then think on them so long that you begin to stew in your hurt and marinate in your bitterness, so that every aspect of your life begins to express this pain and this brokenness? How often in those spaces do you end up externalizing your internal narrative in a way that deepens the brokenness rather than healing it? When we do this, when we ruminate on our narratives, it doesn't make the problem better, it makes the problem bigger. It doesn't make it better, it makes it bigger. Friends, we need to avoid rehearsing narratives that might be untrue and seek out the truth before we decide that our version is true. We have to stop it. Stop rehearsing the narratives in your head that might be untrue. Seek it out. How do we do this? The first is this. You have to learn, we have to learn, I have to learn, all of us have to learn to first check our assumptions. Where are the spaces where it's possible that you're filling in gaps in the story with guesses? If you're filling in key parts, key elements of the story of your relationships with guesswork, then you are putting your relationships in danger. And even with those assumptions that you kind of made some best guesses, if you hold too tightly to those, guess what happens when you hold too tightly to something? You make a fist. And what do you use fists for? For attacking, for aggression, for inflicting wounds. We need to hold on to our assumptions with open hands, knowing that there's a possibility that these gaps that I filled in with my own imagination, those gaps, I might have filled them in ways that don't actually connect with reality. First, we have to check our assumptions before we become so confident in our truth that we can't accept the truth when it's revealed. Has that ever happened to you when you fill in, you make a whole bunch of assumptions, and then you finally talk to the person about the story that you've told yourself about, and then they tell you, gosh, that's not true. No, that's not what I did. Could you help me understand why you said that? Or did I understand you clearly when you said this? And then you just listened with open hands rather than closed fists. It's possible that the true story is still hurtful. It's possible that the true story is still going to cause pain and brokenness in your relationships, but at least you're operating out of the truth rather than operating out of a lie. What if instead of going in with accusations, we ask ourselves, what do I know for sure is true? And how did I come to that truth? Who did I hear it from? Did the truth that I know come to me secondhand, third hand, fourth hand, sixth hand, or did it come straight from the person? And who do I need to talk to discover the full truth? And I'll give you a hint. It's not everyone else that has nothing to do with the problem. It's the people that are involved. You're not going to discover the truth in the gossip mill. You discover the truth by direct engagement with the people involved. We discover the truth by beginning in prayer and asking God to examine our own hearts and say, Lord, I need help in this. Help me to have a heart that's ready to engage. Help me to have open hands rather than closed fists. It starts with prayer, but it can't end with prayer. We have to allow prayer to move us towards engagement with the people around us. We have to allow prayer to move us to a place where we handle conflict in a way that honors God. Because here's the thing, the way we handle conflict matters to God. Because we matter to God. You matter to God. I matter to God. The way we handle conflict matters to God because we are important to him. And healthy relationships between us is the key hallmark of what makes us us. So incredibly important. We have to handle conflict well because if we don't, we'll pass it on to the next generation. We have to handle conflict because God tells us that we need to do it. Matthew chapter 5, jumping into the New Testament. I love this verse and I am convicted by this verse. It says this, therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Text says, hey, if you are in a moment of prayer, if you're in a moment of worship, if you're sitting in church on Sunday and you are sitting there and a conflict pops into your head. In this case, they're talking specifically about coming to a realization that you did something, that you were the one who wounded someone. You were the one that caused pain. If something happens in that moment and God reveals something to you in your spirit that you need, that is an issue in your life, the text clearly says, get up, go out, and engage them. Engage them not to confront or to accuse or to point fingers or to show up with closed fists. Go out to be reconciled to them. This is the heart of God for our relationships. That our times of worship should lead us to reconciliation. That our times of worship should point us towards healthy conflict engagement rather than simply conflict avoidance. That our times of worship should help us to engage conflict before it escalates into something that it never needed to be. That our times of worship would encourage us to seek the truth rather than inventing a narrative in our own brain. And that our times of worship would lead us to a space where our relationships honor God and they flourish to their fullness. And always. My hope is that our time of worship today would be that for you. My hope is that this space today would do that for you. Today we have an opportunity to receive communion. But it's also an opportunity for us to examine ourselves. It's an opportunity for us to pause and reflect on all of the stuff that I just gave you. It's a lot, right? It's a lot. Some of you are sitting here thinking, oh my goodness, I have a lot of work to do. Start small. Maybe the way you need to start is simply by some self-reflection. Maybe the way you need to start is by getting up during this time and going back to the back and receiving some prayer from our prayer team. Maybe you already know in your head who the person is that you need to start small with. But whatever place you find yourself in today, my prayer is that you would take this moment, this act of worship as an opportunity to examine. Examine your life. Examine your relationships. Ask God to give you that 1,000-foot view. That 1,000-foot view as you look down in your own life in the situation. And if you're here in this place today, and you're saying, my family never did this well. My family never actually taught me how to do this well. If you're looking at your own brokenness and your own past, and you're saying, I need to start new. Today is an opportunity to join God's family. Today is an opportunity to learn a new way of doing life, a new way of experiencing relationships. And if that's you, in a moment, I'm going to pray, and I just invite you to pray with me as you step into God's family. But before we do that, I want you to hear the words that Jesus said before he went to the cross, before he died, before he rose from the dead. He sat at a dinner table with friends, one of whom was about to betray him. Conflict was about to emerge. And after praying, he took the bread and he broke it. He said, "This is my body, broken for you." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup and he said, "This cup is a new promise between myself and you. And as often as you eat the bread and you drink the cup, you proclaim my death until I come again." Jesus did this to create a pathway to reconciliation. Jesus did this to create a pathway of reconciliation between God and people, but he also did this to create a pathway to reconciliation between people and their brothers and sisters. Allow it to be that for you today. I want to invite Dave Walter to come and help me serve communion. I'm going to pray for you, then I want to give you the space. We have these little crackers that are gluten-free that everyone can engage in, cups of juice. We'll invite you to come down. You can receive communion when you're ready. If you are a follower of Jesus, even if today you pray for the very first time to step into God's family, this table is for you. Would you pray with me? Jesus, I am overwhelmed by your love for us. I am overwhelmed by your desire to point us towards a pathway of wholeness, of healing, of beauty in our relationships. God, I'm overwhelmed by the way you care about the micro details and the macro details of my life. I'm overwhelmed by the way you look at my relationships and our relationships, the way you look at my marriage, you look at our marriages, the way you look at our interactions with our coworkers. You say, I want to be involved in that because I want to bring you to fullness. So God, today we come to you. Some of us very aware of our brokenness. Some of us very aware that we need to start fresh, re-identifying ourselves, or maybe identifying ourselves for the first time with your family. And so we come to you today, God, with open hands. Take our mess. Take our conflict. Take our relationships. Take our lives, God. We commit ourselves to you and to your ways. Jesus, forgive us for the ways that we have messed this up and help to set our feet on a new path. We choose you. We choose your way. God, I pray that right now you would begin even now to reveal to the people here in this room the relationships that they need to engage in, the conversations that they need to have, and I pray that you would give them the strength to do it. Examine us, Lord. We come to you with open hands. In the name of Jesus, amen.